Workflow is just getting information, in our case, records in our system, in front of the right people at the right times. Workflow is just a series of steps that these records go through while they're being processed. Some of those steps are automatic, where we can extract information, do conversions, things like that. And others are manual, where we have to stop for somebody to evaluate something and click a button. So just keep that in mind. It's kind of a mix of everything, automatic and manual. It's just a series of steps you're walking the information through. And those steps in our system are called triggers. Now, once we get into it and I start explaining what a trigger is, it'll make more sense. In some workflow systems, you push the information through from step to step to step, and it's really more of a push process. In ours, it's more of a catch, or I would say a pull, but it's more of a catching system where you set up a trigger that will react at a certain time. So as the information is going through, the workflow engine will look at the item coming through and will compare that to the triggers that it has to go through and say, oh, this one, I should trigger this one because the record matches what it's looking for. And then you'll perform actions on it, stop for somebody to work on it if you want to, whatever the step does. And then after that, it'll continue on its way. In Doc Management, if you're an administrator, you can go to the admin menu and go to workflow. And that takes you to our list of workflow triggers, if you will. They can be triggers or processes. We'll talk about that in a second. But this is how you would define your list of triggers. The work items would come in and they would just go from step to step to step, stop when they need to, skip when they don't need to, stop, whatever, until they're all done, and then they're out of the system. Probably the most crucial parts of the system in workflow then is knowing how to set it up so that items stop at the right time, at the right place. We just have to make sure that we've configured what we call our activation rules to be able to allow items to come in the workflow. So for instance, if you look at the screen, we have an invoices process. Inside there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 triggers. And what's going to happen if an invoice comes in, it's going to start at the top of the invoices list and go, do I have to OCR? If I do, stop here and do the OCR. If I don't, then go past it and go to splitting, and then same thing with invoice indexing, and then invoice review, and then exporting to accounting system. So it just kind of starts top to bottom, stops when it needs to. When it's done, then it can move on. So rather than having a GUI system where you draw your boxes and you connect your arrows, you're just letting the record come in the top of the list, and it will drop to the place it needs to do its work, and then go on. So before I get into too much detail on that, I want to go show you the activation rules. There are some built-in activation rules. That's why this is a good example. In order to OCR something, we need to have this trigger activate, right? So the activation rules are, if this record has not been OCR'd, then stop. That's the activation rule. So what's going to happen is, if a record comes in, a new invoice comes in, it's going to say, have you been OCR'd? No? Okay, then stop here. And it's going to stop, and it's going to wait till the OCR is done. And after that, it can go to the next one. Okay, what's the next activation rule? Has this record been split? If it hasn't, then it will be split, which means it'll break the invoice into from one big PDF to multiple smaller ones, and so on and so forth. Now, this one's a little different. This one says, is the invoice indexed field blank? Okay, and if it is, stop here. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. So regardless of what type of rule you use, that rule has to be fulfilled before it can go on. So let's say that I had a record type check of invoices. Okay, if the record coming in is of type invoice, stop here. Okay. Now, before I dig too much into the details on that, let me just go back a step and talk about processes versus triggers. Okay, we have a process here called the invoices process. Inside of there, 5 triggers. The process, if we edit the process, it has its own activation rules. It says if the record type is AP invoices, then I'm a valid process. So what that means is if an invoice comes in, it's going to look inside the process to see if it has anything to do. However, if it's an HR application, HR employee, or something other than AP invoices, the record will look at this and say, well, I'm not an invoice. I'm not even going to bother going in the process. I'll look for something else to do. Okay. So one of the best things you can do with your workflow is make sure you put all of your triggers into processes that immediately segment them from other items. So HR documents don't go into the invoices process to do anything in here because that's not relevant to an HR document. So you would probably set up another process, and I call it the HR process. And that would activate if, let's just do the applications one. If the record type is HR applications, come in here. I'll call this applications. Okay. So now we have a process for applications. There's no triggers in there, but we have a process, and we can start adding triggers to it. So that's the first takeaway from here is make sure you segment your workflows, not only for efficiency, but just for management. It allows you to immediately know that, okay, this is going to handle HR stuff. If I'm dealing with invoices, I don't even have to look inside this process. I can focus my attention down here. Once an invoice comes in and it knows, okay, I'm not an HR application, it's going to skip this process. Am I an invoice? Hey, I am. Great, I can do this stuff. And it's going to go in here. It's going to say, have I been OCR? Nope. But it's going to stop here. And it's going to assign it to, I believe, the agent user, okay, which is important for OCR, which I will talk about. It's going to stop and wait for the OCR to be done. When the OCR gets done, that agent user that does the OCRing is going to automatically complete this workflow step for us. Now, at that point, you might think that it's just going to go to the next step regardless, but that's not quite true, okay? When a workflow trigger stops, or when a workflow stops at a trigger, next time it gets activated to move, it goes back to the top of the process it's in. It goes back up here and says, oh, I'm in the invoices process. And it says, is this process still valid? So in other words, am I still an invoice? I am? Okay, then I can keep going. Then it's going to go back down the list and say, do I need to be OCR? Well, now this time through, it has been OCR'd already, so it doesn't need to stop here. It goes past this and goes down to the split. Okay, then it does its splitting. And then when it completes there, it does the same thing. It goes back to the top, looks to see if it needs to do any of these, and it keeps going. Now, if the invoicing step is an automatic step, it's not assigned to anybody. Okay, it's not an assignment step. There's nothing in here, which means it comes in, does its work, and leaves immediately. In that case, it doesn't go back to the top when it's done because it already knows nobody's done anything. Nobody's clicked any buttons, so it just keeps going down, down, down. The only time it goes back to the top is when it has to stop, when it's assigned to someone. Okay. And the reason for this is when somebody clicks a button, they may have changed something. They may have changed it from an invoice to a purchase order. In that case, we want to pop out of this process and go to the purchase order process. Okay. Or they might have hit the reject button, which might make it go up a step or up 2 steps. Okay. So what happens is every time you're done working with it as a user, it goes back to the top and just falls back through to see where to go. So up until now, this one stopped to an agent user. These two were automatic, so technically it would just keep going through when it's done. It gets to invoice review. This one's assigned to someone. They have a couple buttons to click. When they click the button, it goes back up to the top and then goes back down to see where to stop again. Okay. And then after it's done with that, then it goes to the export to accounting and away it goes. So each one of these, they'll have their own activation rules. Like this one's looking for a completed flag that's empty, which means either there's a completed field there, the field name completed in the record without a value, or there is no completed field at all. Either one of those equates to an empty. So that tells me this hasn't been completed, so I can come in here and do my work. And if you notice on this button click, completed gets set to yes when they click that button. So the item comes in, makes its way all the way through the review. It's not completed, so it stops here, gets assigned to whoever's in this team, which we'll talk about assignments in a minute. Somebody in that team clicks one of these buttons. If they click the complete button, we update a couple fields. Completed is yes, and then just sets the status, the invoice reviewed. It's nice to set status fields. Completed equals yes is set. Now, when they click it, it goes back to the top. Am I still an invoice? Yes, I am. Have I been OCR? Yep. Split? Yep. Invoice? Yep. Is the completed flag empty? Not anymore because somebody clicked that button, so then it drops down to here. So it's important to know the sequence of events because that helps you design workflows that can just automatically go back up and down the chain, up and down those steps as needed. So let's say, for instance, the invoice review, somebody finds a problem, okay, and they want to have it re-indexed. Okay, let's just say that this indexing step can be redone over and over again until they feel satisfied. If you look at the invoicing indexing step, what we're looking for here is invoice index equals blank. Now, just a quick note here, the pound sign means blank. So technically, this and this are the same. So you can see them both ways out there, a pound sign or an empty. It means the same thing. Some people prefer to see a pound sign to tell them it's blank rather than not seeing anything. It's totally up to you. But notice it's going to come back to the index invoice because invoice index is blank. Now, once we get done indexing, it goes down here. Maybe on this button click, we add another one that says retry indexing. All I have to do is tell it to delete the value that's in the invoice index field. Okay. Now, what happens when they click that button is it deletes this flag so that when they click the button, it goes back up to the top and it'll drop down to index invoice again. So to get things to move around, it always starts from the top down. So all you have to do is set the right flags or delete the proper flags to get it to go the right place. You don't really need to force things in our system so much as just allow them, right? And that's one of the hardest shifts in mentality from people coming from other systems, especially the ones where they have the GUI drag and drop and you drop arrows between boxes and things like that. In those types of systems, you literally are telling the workflow engine exactly where to go from point A to point B, right? Which in some ways can be nice. It just makes it very clean, but it makes it very hard to maintain. How do you throw two steps in the middle of that line if you have to add a couple processes? You got to redraw lines. Hopefully you've got other conditions in there that aren't too bad. And then you end up with spaghetti code after a year of maintaining it. Whereas in our system, each trigger, think of these as the boxes in the workflow, they're already in the right order. Okay. All you have to say is whether or not to stop there. And now, if you do it right, you can rearrange these steps without really killing anything. You don't have to redraw arrows or boxes or anything like that. Just move it up. So, for instance, if you had maybe before it's automatically indexed, you want to review it, drop it there, done. Save your order. Nothing needs to change. Now it goes to OCR, then it splits, then it stops to get reviewed, then it goes to indexing and on. Now, that might be kind of nonsensical because why would you review it before the indexing is done? But technically, it would work. Whereas in other systems, like I said, you'd have to redraw boxes and check your conditions and all that. So it's very important that each of these triggers stays, really just takes care of itself only. And the only time you have to care about any other triggers is if you want to push something back up from like a rejection, right? So because the OCR doesn't care where it's going next, doesn't care how it got there. It says, hey, if I need to come in here, come in, I'll do the OCR. Okay. And when I'm done with that, just drop it off. I don't care where it goes next. Same thing with a split. It knows, hey, I got here, I got to split these records. These document in multiples. So make them completely independent. They don't look at anybody else. They don't care about anybody else. And that's going to make your life 10 times easier because you can just drag and drop and rearrange all you want. And it's really not much of an issue. Okay. The rejections are the one point, like I said, that kind of become the exception because if you have a rejection step in here, when they click the reject button, you need to tell it how to get back to the rejection step. But here's how I typically do it. Let's just do, I'll just call it rejection. I'm just going to stop here if reject is not blank. So if there's a field in the invoice called reject and that's not empty, then I'm going to stop here. I'll assign it to the same AP team. And I'll give them a button that says, okay, everything's good. Proceed. All right. I'll talk about the action in a second. Now, if I put that up here, I like to put the rejections above the invoice reviews because what's really cool about it is because every time I click a button, it goes back to the top and drops down to see where to go. All I need to do in the invoice review is give them a button that says reject. And then all I have to do is add a field called reject equals yes or something non-empty. Now, when they click that button, it starts back to the top. It says, oh, I've got a rejection. Stop here. They do their work. Once they say, okay, I'm ready to proceed, all I have to do then is get rid of that flag. Delete that rejection flag. Then when they click the button, it goes back up to the top, goes through, nope, don't have to reject, so I'll drop right back down to here again. So it automatically kind of takes care of itself going back to whoever rejected it. If I had, let's say I had 3 review steps, review 1, 2, and 3, I could set it up so that if any one of those rejected it, it just went back to rejection. When they were done, it cleared the rejection flag and went right back to the person who rejected it. So you could go right back to level 3 if you wanted to. That's like the simplest example, actually. So anyway, keep them compartmentalized, keep them really only caring about themselves, and you'll have a lot easier task. And other thing to think about is it's very much a precedent order. So this order that they're in right here is how the system's going to try to execute them, right? Unless there's any flags that don't match, whatever, it'll skip them. But you don't have to worry so much. For instance, once it goes through splitting, if it gets past here, you never have to check down here if the invoice has been split, because it wouldn't make it here if it hadn't been split, because you've made sure that if it's not split, stop here. Same thing with the indexing, and reject, all these things. Essentially, anytime it makes it past a step, you never have to worry about anything above it, unless you want to go back. Okay, so don't put in rules like in the rejection step. Okay, stop here if reject is blank and split is not blank, or whatever, because you don't care how it got here. You just said, oh, somebody said reject. Come on in. That's all you got to worry about. So keep it simple. Okay, let me talk a little bit about these. A little bit more detail, I should say, about the activation rules, okay? I'm not going to go through every one of these types of activation rules, but let me just give you some samples of what things you can check for. So let me just add a new step in here. I'm not going to save this one, but just for an example here, I could say, okay, if the record type is applications, then stop here, okay? Simple enough. I could check if a record field value. So let's say, what do we have in invoices? We have amount, okay? If the amount is not empty, stop here. Or if the amount equals $999, or if it's between $999 and $5,000, stop here. I can do a little bit of a range. There's also an easier way called a value comparison, which would be more like, now if you were in the variables, you'll recognize this, that last session we had. This is take the value in the amount field, and if that is between $999 and $5,000, I like that one better than the other, stop here. Okay. You could look at the record status where it's active or deleted. You can see if it's been processed or not, a whole bunch of stuff. Read through these. There's some documentation on them. You can check due dates, percentages. If you needed to stop every 1 out of every 4, you could say 25% of the time stop here. And if the person who's clicking the buttons in a team, there's all sorts of stuff you can do. You can do record searches if you want to too, in your activation rules. But by and large, keep it simple. Look for field values. Okay, that's your easiest bet. It's also the most efficient thing to look for, because the record is already in memory. All I have to do is look at the amount field, and if it matches the criteria, you're golden. If I do a search, every time the workflow engine comes through to look to see if it needs to execute this, it has to do that search each time, which can be very much of a performance hit. So now, the other thing to consider is there's also multiple rules that may have to match. So let's just say that if you have, this is a fairly real world example. If the vendor is Acme and the amount field is from 10,000, well, actually, let's do this. If the amount is greater than $10,000, okay? So you could have a specific trigger that says, hey, if Acme vendor is trying to submit an invoice that's greater than 10,000, send that to the CFO because they want to see that. Maybe that's a problem vendor, something like that. Okay. Or you can do ors as well. This is an and. Both of these have to be true. Okay. Execute when these two rules are true. I can add another rule set that says or activate when maybe we have another problem vendor. Vendor is Acme 2. And the amount is greater than 50,000, right? Something like that. Right? So maybe the Acme 2 is much less of a problem than Acme 1, so they have a higher threshold, something like that. So now this trigger will activate if either one of these is true. Either the vendor's Acme and the amount is greater than 10,000, or if the vendor's Acme 2 and the amount is greater than 50,000. Okay. Now you can do a lot of combinations of ands and ors, but always gravitate toward the simplest possible way of doing things. Okay, if you're doing if you find yourself with 10 or 20 activation rules, there's something going on. You shouldn't have that many typically. Okay? There can be cases, but they're rare. So if you find yourself having to throw in a bunch of rules, let me know. Give me a call. We'll talk it through. Maybe there's a simpler way of handling it. Okay. Now, something that a lot of you may not have been exposed to yet is the list action type or the rule type. I want to see if the invoices vendor is in this list. It's either Acme or Acme 2 or Johnson and Johnson, whatever. Okay. So this list means if the vendor is any of these three values, then it'll activate. So that's a fairly new one. I wanted to point that one out. That one could save a lot of time and also condenses a lot of these long rules as well. So like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these. The most commonly used ones are right at the top. Typically, the one that's used the most is the record value check. Look in the record, see if the value in this matches what we expect. If not, if it does, come in. Or value comparison, that's another one that's fairly new as well. With the value comparison, make sure you use the brackets. That one is not field aware. You have to give it a variable name right here. This rule is very literal. You must do your own variable replacement. Whereas the record value check is looking for a record value. So if you just have a name there, it looks for a field name. Keep that in mind. So the next thing to talk about is the methodologies that are used to trigger things. So there's 4 basic types, maybe 5 with the hybrid ones. And I actually have an article that we wrote. I will send you a link to this article, okay, called Work Trigger Methods. But basically, it's how to trigger, how to activate. And it goes through these 4 methods: the status method, the flag method, the missing flag or the alternate flag method, and then the data method, okay? And I'm going to talk about each of those very quickly. And then, of course, there's some hybrid methods you can use. The status method is if you, let's say on this HR application, let's add a couple steps here, okay? Step 1 is to review, and let's say this is an application that comes in from the outside world, somebody's applying for a job. Review application, okay? The activation rule on this one might be status equals review. If status is review, assign it to, I'll just put the same team, and we'll give them a button that says okay. And what that does is sets the status to hire. Okay. And I'll put another one in there that is hire. Activate when status is hire. Assign it to the same team. Give them a button, call it done, whatever. And set the status to something other than hire. Done. Okay, the status method essentially uses one field, like we saw in here, called status or something else. And then you set the status of the field to tell it where to go in workflow. One of the benefits of this is it's very simple. Set the status to the name of the trigger if you want to even make it simpler to know exactly what trigger you're sending it to. The downsides of this, though, may not be readily apparent, but there are many downsides to doing this method. One, you have to, at every button click, you've got to know where to take it next. So remember when I talked about keeping these triggers separate? Don't care about anybody else in the world but me, okay? This status method has to know every other possible status. So the higher step or the review step needs to know how to get to the higher step. What status do I need to go there? And every button click has to tell it exactly where to go next. So essentially, you've taken the GUID method, the drag and drop GUID method, the Visio diagram method, and replicated it here without the pretty GUID. So what's the point? And then if I wanted to rearrange these, it wouldn't matter. Oh boy, I've rearranged the step. Well, it doesn't matter because it comes through here and says, well, I'm going to go here first, then here. Oh, wait a minute, let me go back the other way. It's going to come in and go, it's still going to drop here first. Then the next time they click, it'll come back up here because the status comes back to review first, then higher. Plus you have to worry about setting that status to even get started. Let's say you bring in an application and there's no status on it. It's going to go, oh, yep, I'm an application. Nope, done. It's not going to stop anywhere. So to me, there's just too many downsides. And I'll leave it to you to read this article. I'm going to send out a link to it here shortly to read through this. For the status method, the pros, very simple and easy to follow. Planning out your initial workflow is easy because it's really step by step. It seems pretty simple. The cons, every step needs to know what the next step is, right? And if there's an incorrect value, then you can actually miss a step. Okay, you need to know the entire process. And putting steps in the middle, that's one of the worst ones. let's say later on, they say, well, before we hire, after we review, it has to go to do the background checks. Okay, I'll have to add a background check. Now I got to go into this step, tell its button to change the status to background check instead of hire. Then in the background step, I got to make sure to push a button that sends it to the hire. So now I've got to change 2 or 3 steps just to get one step in there, right? Which isn't fair in my mind. It just seems like too much work. So, but that is one method, and it can work. It's just a lot more maintenance in my view. Then there's the flag method. Now the flag method is very similar, except each of these is going to have its own flag. So let's say reviewed. No. Okay. And then when I click the button, I'm going to set reviewed to yes. Okay. And then in hire, I'll do the same thing, hired. No. And when I click the button to hire them, I'll say hired is yes. I got to spell it right. Now, similar, but each step is now independent, right? So you still know that review doesn't have to know where it's going next, which is good. But in order to get back up here, you need to be able to set reviewed to no. And when the initial form comes in, you've got to make sure to set all your flags to the right value. Reviewed equals no, hired equals no, this is no, that is no, that is no. So the flag method is you set a flag to get it somewhere, and then you let its own process, its own button clicks remove its flag, change the flag to get it out of there. Okay? It's better than the status, but to me, it's still not optimal because you have to know when you're putting stuff in the system exactly what flags you have to set to know. Okay, which is to me, it's just like once again, it's more work, and any change in the process makes you go change the E form or wherever you're bringing data in to add more flags. And eventually you're adding way more flags than you need, and it gets to be messy. Now, the reverse of that is the missing flag or the reverse flag method, as I like to call it. Now, this is very similar, but instead of looking for a flag equals no or something, just say, has it been reviewed? Is it blank? That's why I like the blanks better. If reviewed is blank, come in here. Same thing with hired. It's a very small change to go from the flag to the reverse flag. If hired is blank. So now what happens is, same concept, it comes in there, is reviewed blank? Yep, then come on in and be reviewed. The button click says reviewed to yes, so that it'll proceed past this to hire, et cetera, et cetera. The benefits to this are, each trigger still takes care of itself, but even the way into the system, how the eForm gets started, how the import happens, whatever, doesn't have to care about the workflow. Whereas with the flag method, every input had to know the workflow. Okay, so that's why, to me, this is probably one of the optimal methods. Then the data method, which is actually preferred, but it's usually not possible. So the data method actually looks at the data that's being collected to know what to do. The prime example of this is in AP. If you're looking at the value of the total amount of the invoice, if it's empty, then you know that needs to be filled in. Somebody has to index it, right? Same thing with the vendor. If the vendor or the total is blank, stop here for indexing. Okay? So the complement to this, or the parallel here, would be the reviewed flag. Maybe what you're going to do is like a reviewed by or a reviewed date. You could do that as well. So you could say, I'm setting the reviewed by because that's actually used in our system. That gets output, basically by the person who does it. Username. It's not much different than the flag method or the reverse flag method, but you're actually using values that you're going to be looking at rather than just arbitrary flags that you're putting behind the scenes. Because reviewed by might actually have to be put out into a PDF or in an e-form or one of the search fields later on. And that talks about a little bit more detail here. What I like to do is kind of the hybrid. If you have data that you can look at, and then, like I said, in AP, it's very simple. You might have a vendor ID. If the vendor ID is empty, stop here because we have to figure out what vendor it is, right? Same thing with the amount and maybe some other fields you can look at to see if it has to go to, say, indexing. So let's just say I'm going to do an invoice review. Maybe that's in the invoice. Okay, let's do the indexing part. Okay, so this goes to somebody for indexing. We're going to say if the amount is blank, or if the vendor's blank. Okay. So that would take it here if either of those fields is empty, because in AP, you have to know both of those in order to process the invoice. Most other things might be optional. Maybe the invoice date's required, that kind of thing. But those are kind of the key ones. That's great for getting through the initial indexing. And then it goes down here and it gets to invoice review. Somebody sees a problem with it. And they want to send it back to indexing to fix the problem. If all you're doing is looking at data values like the amount and the vendor, then the only way I can get it back to that step is to delete the vendor or the amount. Okay. Well, what if the problem was the due date or the invoice date or something else? You don't really want to have to delete valid data to get it back up to the indexing step. So that's where you would probably use a bit of a hybrid method like here. They'd say, okay, I come back here if the amount is blank or if the vendor is blank, or if reindex is not blank. Now, all I'd have to do in a rejection step is just set reindex equal to young. Okay, I don't have to blank out the amount or the vendor. Those two are kind of the data values. This one's the flag value. And if I either have missing data values or if I set the flag value, I'll get back to this step. That's where the hybrid approach is good, because you can keep your data, not have to mess up your data, but you can still get things back with flags when you need to. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about this for now because this article helps a lot, and I've got some other articles I'm going to forward to you as well. And for the video, if you go search Workflow Part 4 on our site, you'll find it. Let's dig in a little bit deeper into assignments now. Okay, so let's look at these HROs. Now, once the trigger's been activated because of the rule, let's put it that way. Once this rule has been deemed true, the system will look to who to assign it to, okay? And so far, I've been assigning it to a team or a user here, which is probably, if you have teams built out, that's probably a good way to do it, at least to start there. But there are other ways you can assign things. You can do multiple users. Let me just go ahead and throw a couple in there, and a couple teams if you've got them. Then what happens is when it goes to assign, it'll look at these two people plus everybody in this team, and it assigns to all of them. So it's a combination of all these who it gets assigned to. It also will take any dynamics, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also add those to the list. So you could have more than just these. You could have several more. And then what happens is the first person who clicks on the item from workflow takes ownership. So even if 10 people got it assigned to them, the first one who clicks that one takes it. Anybody else who tries to take it gets a message saying this one's already been taken. Now you can change that behavior a little bit by turning on this keep assigned to all. That way, even if I click on it, everybody else can still click on it. But the problem with that is you have to be in communication because you might accidentally be working the same items. So use that one only when people are in close proximity and can work out who's going to deal with it. Or you can do round robin, which will take everybody in this and just kind of go in a circle. And okay, now you get this one, you get the next one, you get the next one, you get the next one. So it only goes to one person at a time. Now, these are fairly straightforward. I'll talk about the managers in a second. It's either users or teams, the combination of both. Dynamic, though, gets fun. Because with dynamic, if you put in a field name, let's say reviewers or approver, okay, let's just say that's the field name. If you have a field name here, what'll happen is when it gets to this step, it'll actually look in the record that's coming through and look for a field named approver. And if it finds it, whatever value is in that approver field, that's who it gets assigned to. Either the user ID can be in there, the user name can be in there, or the email, I believe, can be in there too. For sure, the ID and the username, I'll check on the email. And that's what I use all the time, is one of the two. So the user ID or the username could be in there. That's who it gets assigned to. Now, with our system, as most of you know, you can have multiple fields of the same name in your record. So you could actually have 5 approver fields in your record with 5 different usernames. When you use a dynamic assignment, it'll use all of those to assign it to all 5. So if there's 5 approver fields, plus there's these 3 people, and there are 2 people in a team here, it takes all the combination of all those and assigns it to everybody who's in that list. So what's really fun about the dynamic is you can actually feed the approvers or whatever who's assigned to this step. You can feed that in with your importer. You can have people selected on a drop down in an e-form or multi-selected in an e-form. It doesn't matter how the data gets there. If it's in that field, it'll be used. So if you're looking at ways to do dynamic assignments, you can actually build forms or drop downs or add-ins even that'll prompt you for the user and give people a way to select the user to assign it to. So it's a good way to do reassignment, selective reassignment. You could do the same thing with teams. Maybe you have a field called approver team. Same thing applies. It'll look for an approver team field or fields, and it'll look to see if there's any teams with a name that match those field values. If there are, then it uses those teams for assignment. Now, there is one slight variation in this. If you happen to do a bracketed value, that will actually do a replacement with our variable replacement engine, and it basically resolves to a single user or team, if you use it in the brackets here, and it'll assign to that one user from the dynamic side, plus whoever's on the static too. But this is basically going to look for a single value, whereas without the brackets, it looks for maybe multiple fields. So you can do multiple approvers that way, assignments. Okay. Now, another one that's less used, but very exciting, is the filtered assignment. Now, these two are great for most cases, but sometimes you want to make exceptions. And rather than having to build a huge lookup matrix for 2 entries, that looking back at that Acme problem vendor, you could say, okay, I'm going to assign it to the AP team. But if an item comes through where the vendor is Acme, I want that to go to this specific user. Maybe it's the CFO or whoever. Once again, you might have a problem vendor. Hey, anybody get something from Acme, send it to me. Well, you don't have to do some kind of lookup matrix to do that. You could do it under the filtered. What happens is the system will first go to filtered. If it finds a match, it just assigns it to whoever you got. By team, by user, by dynamic. You have also the dynamics over here, right? It will assign it to that, and it won't even bother looking at dynamic and static. If it doesn't find a filter, then it goes back and looks at these two. So you know that if it's in the filtered match, it's not going to anybody else except who you tell it to here. And you can add multiples here. So, okay, what about that Acme too? Same thing here. Assign that one to admin. And you can also do amounts too here if you want to do the amount, from 100 to 1,000, whatever. So you can do the ands here as well. So really, each of these filter assignments is kind of the or, and these are kind of the ands inside. So it's a little bit like the rules, the activation rules, but it's just setting assignments. And if you really want to go crazy, you can turn this flag on. Now, if one of the AP people, for instance, in this case, they're assigned to this step, if they see an invoice come through for, Acme, but we didn't have these rules in here, they actually could add their own filtered rule in the interface. It'll ask you, okay, when you go to manually reassign this step to, let's say, to admin, it'll ask you, why are you assigning this to them? And do you want it to always assign it to them? And they can say, yeah, I'm assigning it because it's the Acme one and because of the amount. Send it to admin, and it'll add a rule in here for you. The next time something comes through for Acme for this amount, it'll send it on to the same person. So you're basically allowing them to administer your filtered list. So the big thing about this was filtered first. If no match, then we'll fall back on dynamic or static. All right, let's talk about some actions now. So now we know if it's activated, it looks at these rules to determine whether to activate. If it is, it'll figure out who to assign it to. Now, before it actually sends a note to any of these users saying, hey, you have something to do, it starts doing actions first. The first set of actions is the assignment actions. So we know who it's going to, but we're not telling them yet until we run these actions. Now, this is where you might set things like a status field. Okay, status is now in review, or whatever. It's the review application step, so it's in the review process, right? So then it assigns it to that person, sets the status first, and then it sends a notification to whoever that this application is ready for you to look at. Okay? Now, when that person sees it in their workflow list and clicks on it, it takes it away from anybody else's assigned and assigns it just to them, but it also triggers another action type called the working actions. That means you're now working the item. When that happens, you could then do something like changing the status to being worked by And then let's see, what is it? Is it the workflow assigned? There it is, workflow assigned name. Okay, so I could say being worked by workflow assigned name. So whoever clicked the button, that's their name going to be in there. So now your status reflects who's actually doing the work, not just the fact that it's being worked. Now let's just say I get in there and I look at it and go, oh, I shouldn't be doing this one. I want to reassign it to someone or put it back in the queue. And if I don't know if I have anything active here to do that with. No, I don't. Let's see here. Okay, let me go ahead and route that. Okay, so I get in here and I figure, oh, this isn't mine. I shouldn't be looking at that one. I already clicked on it and took it. I could actually hit the default button. That'll reassign it back to the default list of users. So let's say there was 5 people assigned to it. I clicked it. I took it from the other 4. I look at it. Ooh, I need to put this back. Maybe it's too late in the day. I can't finish it, or it's not mine. I click this button, and it reassigns it back to whoever's supposed to be doing it, including me. Now it's assigned to all 5 of us again. That reassignment actually triggers this reassign action step. Okay, so you can actually run actions on that little reassign I did. Or if I would have selected a specific user to assign it to, I would have done that as well. Then after all that's done and I'm working it, now the buttons are available for me to click. Now in the interface, you saw it up here. Let me just go ahead and select the item. Okay, I have a button down here called OK because that's all I actually programmed was OK. If you click on the workflow button here, you'll see all the items here as well, the buttons, but there's only one, of course. When I click that, then the actions inside the button will happen. All we're doing here is setting a field called reviewed by to my username. And if you remember, this activation rules was reviewed by is blank. So once I click that button, if I look at my raw data here, all I have is the address, application date, date of birth, name, and record type. I don't have any of the workflow flags here. But if I go and click this, processing work item, and then I go back and look at my data again, now I have a reviewed by flag. Because that's what that button did. It set the reviewed by flag. And because of that, it was able to go to the next step, which is the hire button. So if I look at my workflow report, now it's at the hire step. And before that, it was at the review application step. I completed it this date and time, and it went to B-Boss, back to me again. So in this case, like I said, we're just setting flags. So once you set them, it's going to be in the record. Now it's available for anybody to see. Now let's look at that hire. I think I put a button in here to say hired, right? Yeah, hired is yes. I'm going to put another one in there. I'm going to put a rejection on it. All it's going to do is set the flag. What would he call it? Reviewed by. I'm just going to delete the reviewed by flag. Delete, save. Now, if I come back here and I click the done button, actually, I should call these something other than done on both of them. So I'm going to say hired on this one. And on the other one, I'm going to put reviewed. That way it's easier to tell which step we're on. Okay. All right, I'm going to go back here, refresh my list. Well, I'll just click it again. Okay, now I have hired or reject. I'm going to reject it. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is look at my raw data. Reviewed by is gone. And if I look at the step I'm on the review application step. Click reviewed again, it's going to set reviewed by, and then if I click hired, it's going to set hired by or whatever. Hired, and then it's gone. Okay. If I look at my raw, oops, not close my tab. Let me look at my raw data. I have a hired, yes, and reviewed by was me, which is exactly what the workflow was supposed to do. And then once it's done, if it doesn't find any other triggers to stop, it's out of the workflow. You don't need an end step or a stop step or anything like that. Typically, you just let it fall right out of the workflow. If it doesn't find any more work to do, it's gone. For those of you who have been through workflow a lot of this was just all review for you. But I do want to go back through and talk about those action types real quick. All right. So up to now, we've been setting some values. With the button click, we set a value. There are a lot of 128 actions now, if I remember right, that you can do. updating fields, multi-updates, renaming fields, adding record notes, copying records, creating records, deleting records, restoring. You see the list here. All right, and you can just type in here to get to something. There's a bunch of loops you can do: an action loop, document loop, line item loops, table row loops, CSV line loops. So each of these could almost be a class in and of itself, really. But the one thing they all have in common is the fact that those variables we learned in our last session are used across the board. And there's hardly any of these actions that you will use that don't use a variable. So make sure you understand how variables work. That's key one. And key two, then we did talk a little bit about in the variable section when we talked about these loops. Let's do line item loop, for instance. You have what we call our active record and our alternate records. That's another big thing to worry about. And I think we've actually accounted for some of these. Yeah, you'll notice now we actually have on our drop down these bracketed with the brackets and the angle braces. So you'll notice that now in your variable list, you can actually get to those a little simpler. That means grab the ID of the alternate record, whereas this means grab the ID of the active record. And remember that inside of a loop of any kind, outside the loop, the active record is the record you started at, right? The invoice. When you're in the loop, now this is a line item loop, so this one's actually going to have the same record ID internally. But one of these other loops, like let's do like search and run actions. If you do a search for other records, let's say I want to find invoices where the amount is, less than my amount or something like that, equals my amount. When I'm running actions in here, each of those, the record ID is actually the one we found in our search, whereas the alternate is the record we started in, the invoice. And this is probably the biggest source of confusion is when do I use alternate versus active, okay? The rule of thumb is if you're in a loop like this to search and do something, the alternate is the one that started the search. The active is the one that you found in the search. Okay? So that's your invoice record ID. And this might be the record ID of the other invoice you found that matched my amount in this case. I know we're coming up on time here. This is why I figured we're probably going to have a workflow too, because I really want to get into some of the more heavy stuff. Since we have a little time, I want to talk about add-ins because they are very much complementary to workflow. Add-ins are essentially workflow without having to do workflow, right? Add-ins create buttons that you can place in the interface, either up here or in a record or on a search screen that will perform actions exactly the same way a workflow will, except you don't have to worry about routing things and who to assign it to and all that. Instead, you worry about who to show it to. So I'm going to create a new add-in here. Let's see, update all invoices. We probably only have one in the system. What I'm going to do with it is I'm going to show it in the search screen. Actually, no, I'll show it in the toolbar, up in the toolbar. And all it's going to do is one of those search and updates. Do a search and update. I'm going to find all the invoices. I'll just do all invoices. I'm not even going to filter it. For every invoice, I want to update that invoice record with found equals yes. That's all it's going to do. There we go. Now let's go find our invoices. Doesn't matter which one. It should have done them all. Edit. Raw data. Oh, there's my found equals yes. So those add-ins, like I said, they can be actually workflow without workflow. You can build add-in buttons to complement your workflow. So you don't actually have to give people workflow buttons to do things. You can make an add-in inside of a record, inside of a search screen. If you do it inside search, then it'll run those actions on every record in the search or the ones that they check in the search results. And then you can actually put them, like I said, if there's any documents selected, you can have them operate on the documents that were selected, all sorts of things.